Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 82nd video in our Master Series and the 13th video in our Mixing Concepts. The last video was supposed to be the last video, but I think this one and one more at the very end is we'll do it before we get into our mixing. But I wanted to address one more thing, the importance of what we're doing here from here on out, and this is a mixing concept. That is subgroup mixing, subgroup processing, group mixing, and then group processing. And the importance of why that myself sees that it's a good way to set up your process that way. First of all, we've gotten done with our first phase processing. Hopefully done a really good job at that. And we want to basically at this point that we want to get our subgroups mixed well. The concept here is that if you spend the time, any subgroups you have, meaning, a doubled vocal track, 2 or 3 guitars, 5 cellos, the drum set, anything, a few synths that you have together, working together, anything like that, any subgroup that you have, to make a subgroup mix of them, to mix them together as well as possible so they sound as good as possible on their own. Does that make sense? Now, we talked about this concept being the problem with mixing is that when we start mixing, that we are going to have, mixing is one of those things that you're going to take one step forward and half a step back, one step forward and half a step back. It can sometimes work that way because when you get into subgroup mixing, you're very likely to do a really good job to revisit the editing and the processing that you've done so far on the individual tracks. And that's okay. That's a good thing to make them sound as well as they can together. So that's important. So besides that and that subgroup mixing, that you're making those combined tracks, those groups, sound as good as they can all by themselves. Now, the concept here is when you get into mixing, that just like now in subgroup mixing or in this subgroup mixing phase, that you may step back into processing and editing to revisit that, to make adjustments to those individual tracks. You also will in group mixing. Does that make sense? You may take a step back to the subgroup mixing bus or the subgroup processing bus or go all the way back to the individual tracks to make individual adjustments on them. So this whole process here, normally I do it in 4 stages because it works really well. Once I've got those subgroup mixes mixed really well, I've went and addressed anything going on those individual tracks, I go to subgroup processing. Subgroup processing is basically that it's just like doing the processing only on that group. So that I might have some processing that I can't really do on the individual tracks. Well, I probably maybe could, but sometimes some things you do to groups to help them blend together well, or to help glue them together well, or to give them space. Sometimes I'll even do equalization a little bit on subgroup processing so that, they are starting to mix together. And I went and refined them pretty well on their individual tracks, but I'm going to go check it out on my subgroup processing to maybe do some rework on equalization to help them sound better together. Or any of the processing that I might have done, I might revisit in that subgroup processing to help that group get processed to sound as good as possible. And that sounds funny, but sometimes it can just make your production shine, that extra little bit you put in your subgroup processing. And, cause you to go back and revisit the subgroup mix, and might cause you to go back and revisit those individual tracks to do adjustments on them and revisiting, editing, and process again. So that may sound complicated, but it's just kind of goes on and on like that sometimes. And then you get into group mixing. You start mixing any individual tracks you have in any of those subgroups together that as you start to do that process, that you may go back to your subgroup processing and visit that a little bit to make adjustments, which might cause you to go back and revisit any of those individual tracks in those subgroups and revisit any processing or editing that might have happened there to try to help it work better together with the mix. Because as you start mixing them all together, you might start realizing, oh, wait a minute, Now that I'm blending that together, well, I really need to go back and visit. I'll go back one step at a time, visit the subgroup processing bus, check any of that out, see what's going on, or any FX sends you did, see what's happening there. If not, go back to the subgroup itself and start revisiting those individual tracks to find out what problem, what track might be the problem that you might need to make adjustments on to make the whole, group mix sound really good. So it's a really important process. And when as you go through your group mixing, that there are other things that are going to happen while you're group mixing and adjustments that you're going to make to them. You're more than likely at this point you're going to have either subgroup processing bus or individual buses or VCAs and things like that you're working with to make adjustments on there, first of all, that are really going to help you be able to see how it's going together. And once you've got that fairly laid out about as well as you can, and it's basically mixed as what you've went back to even the individual tracks to the subgroup processing buses and their FX sends or whatever, and fine tune it as well as possible and got the mix fine tuned as possible, you're going to go into group processing. And when you get into group processing, basically it's any processing you can do to, once you've listened to it, that you've probably done quite a bit of it in your group mixing, them back and revisiting things. But you also, when you get into group processing, you might be revisiting any one of those things. It might cause you to go back and revisit editing, processing, individual tracks, the subgroup processing bus, go back and do work on individual tracks, their buses themselves or anything like that. And also that I normally have a chain that's group processing, that all of my processing that I would normally do on an audio track that we talked about in processing, I have a bus set up for that, and I go through it one step at a time. Do I want to do any of that type of processing on this group? Because when you have the whole group mixed, it basically becomes one sound. If you look at a piece of audio or a sinusoid, one sinusoid is one sinusoid. If you look at a complex waveform that would be a whole symphony, that it's basically on an oscilloscope looks like one sound. Or on a spectrogram, that's basically one sound. It's a bunch of sounds mixed together, but if you take any moment of it in time, it's one sound. And you might want to process that one sound a little bit more or do some other processing on it to make that sound as good as possible. That might not be possible to do it on the individual tracks, or might be way too tedious and time consuming, or you might not be able to find it. That you might be able to do a little bit of processing on the whole thing and the whole mix as one sound to get it done. And also there are things you can do to help glue the mix together to make things sound more I don't know if in context isn't the correct word, but more glued together. It's like, I don't know how to say that. Sometimes you can do things to make certain aspects of the sound to stand out and certain aspects to sound like they're blended together better and all kinds of things. And maybe you might end up having some compression, or you might have some little teeny bit of equalization that you might want to do. Most of the time it's really fine tuning kind of stuff. That's just really just basically just fine tuning that whole mix with, going through each one of the processes you might do on a piece of audio and fine tuning that whole mix as one sound, like it's one audio track. Does that make sense? And fine tuning it as well as possible. Once you get done with that, you've done as good a job as possible, and that mix sounds like you could play it on the radio, bro, as best as you can get it done. Yeah, dude. And then you go into mastering, which mastering is another process which basically may not be exactly what you might think by the time we get done with this series, but you will understand it really well and understand what the process is, and it won't seem so mysterious to you. So these four groups in this process to me are very important, and I see it that way after studying audio engineering and music for a long time, because it works really well. It gives you a chance, and you understand it's a step forward. It might be a half a step back, a step forward, a half a step back, a step forward, a half a step back, and then bam, you got it done. You know, because it kind of works that way as you tinker with things and fine tune things and start hearing problems as you move forward through a mix to do as good a job as possible and to have those as individual phases to help you do as good a job as possible as an audio engineer. So I wanted to kind of address that really quick to point out the importance of that. And in the next video, we are just going to kind of wrap up the mixing concepts, and then we will get into subgroup mixing. So peace, self-love. I hope you enjoyed this series on mixing concepts, and I'll see you real soon when we start our subgroup mixing.